You begin with the quiet assumption that thought is your primary instrument for understanding reality. You rely on it so completely that the idea of stepping outside of thought feels almost inconceivable. Every conclusion you reach, every interpretation you form, emerges within the structure of the mind. It is natural to trust it because you have never known any other perspective from which to verify its working. Yet Al-Ghazali challenges this comfort. He asks whether a tool confined to its own operation can ever assess its own accuracy. If thought shapes all your judgments, then your certainty depends entirely on the very process you are trying to evaluate. This raises a deeper question. Do you trust your conclusions because they are true, or because the mind repeats them until they feel familiar? If the mind cannot step beyond its own structure, how can it know what lies outside thought? Al-Ghazali lived in 11th century Baghdad, a place defined by intellectual rigor. Scholars debated intricate points of theology, philosophers constructed detailed systems of reasoning, jurists refined principles of law, and mystics explored dimensions of inner awareness. Each group believed it possessed the most reliable method for arriving at truth. Yet amid this landscape of confidence, Al-Ghazali noticed a shared difficulty. Every school depended on the same instrument, the mind, and each assumed that its structure was trustworthy. None examined the foundation on which all reasoning stood. If every discipline depends on the same judge, who evaluates the judge itself? As he advanced in scholarship, Al-Ghazali encountered a crisis. He realized that every domain of knowledge, philosophical, theological, scientific, rested on assumptions that had never been questioned. Theologians assumed certain premises about revelation, philosophers assumed the reliability of reason, and jurists assumed the authority of inherited interpretation. Each structure was internally coherent yet unable to validate its own foundation. You begin to sense the same issue in yourself. What you call knowledge may simply be the natural result of thinking within a particular system. Your conclusions feel stable not because they reflect truth, but because they align with what your mind already accepts. If the foundation of knowledge can be doubted, what remains when the foundation itself is examined? Al-Ghazali did not dismiss reason, he clarified its scope. He observed that reason is excellent for organizing information, comparing ideas, and identifying inconsistencies. It can analyze patterns, form judgments, and expose error. But no matter how refined its operations become, reason cannot verify its own initial assumptions. You begin to see this limitation more clearly. You can argue effectively and defend your conclusions with precision. Yet you cannot use reasoning alone to prove that the principles guiding your reasoning are valid. Logic can confirm that a conclusion follows from a premise, but not whether the premise truly corresponds to reality. Reason can refine thought but cannot step beyond thought. This becomes most apparent when you ask fundamental questions. What justifies the certainty of your judgments? Why should the mind structure be trusted? Reason cannot answer these questions without appealing to itself, creating a circular explanation that never leaves its own boundary. If reason can map the world but cannot confirm its own reliability, how complete can the map truly be? As you examine your thinking more closely, you notice how thoughts arise without intention. Judgments form automatically, preferences appear spontaneously, and beliefs feel natural simply because they have been repeated for years or woven into your upbringing. What seems like deliberate reasoning often begins from assumptions you never consciously chose. Al-Ghazali emphasized this point. The mind inherits its starting conditions. It does not select the principles it uses to interpret reality, it receives them from culture, memory, habit, and authority. Because these foundations are unexamined, the conclusions they produce cannot claim certainty. The structure of thought is shaped by influences you did not consciously evaluate. You begin to see how often your conclusions reflect the path of least resistance within your own thinking. The mind favors what reduces internal conflict, supports established beliefs, or aligns with desire. What appears as objective reasoning may simply be the mind arranging ideas to protect its own comfort. If belief arises before reflection, can reflection ever be fully independent? As Al-Ghazali continued his inquiry, he reached a point where thinking could no longer advance the search for certainty. Every argument had a counterargument, every conclusion revealed a hidden premise, and every premise depended on another assumption. The more he analyzed, the more he recognized that thought could dismantle itself endlessly without reaching a final point of assurance. You encounter the same experience when you probe deeply enough. You realize that thought is capable of questioning itself indefinitely. Yet no matter how many layers you peel back, the foundation remains inaccessible to pure reasoning. The effort becomes circular. Thinking examines thinking, but cannot escape its own frame. Eventually, the intellect reaches exhaustion, not because it fails, but because it recognizes its limit. At this breakpoint, a new question arises. If thought cannot deliver ultimate certainty, what can? And if the search for truth extends beyond the capacity of the intellect, what kind of awareness is required to perceive it? When thinking reaches its endpoint, what remains that can still know? Al-Ghazali's crisis did not end in despair. It opened a new dimension of inquiry. He discovered that clarity sometimes emerges not from increasing analysis but from suspending it. When thought becomes quiet, a different mode of awareness appears, one that does not rely on constructing arguments or defending positions. This shift is not anti-rational. It does not dismiss reason but recognizes that reason is not the origin of truth. The mind can interpret, refine, and articulate understanding, but it cannot create it. Insight arises from a more fundamental level of awareness, one that does not require thought to justify itself. You begin to sense this distinction within your own experience. When the mind stops trying to grasp certainty, a quieter recognition emerges. It is not an argument, not a conclusion, not a belief. It is a direct awareness that does not need reasoning to support it. This awareness is not opposed to thinking. It simply does not depend on it. Al-Ghazali described this realization carefully. The intellect can prepare the ground, but the actual clarity arises from a shift in the condition of the inner self. Thought organizes, awareness recognizes. If true clarity arises only when thinking pauses, then is thinking the path to truth, or merely the preparation for it? After reaching this deeper understanding, Al-Ghazali did not abandon the intellect. Instead, he restored it to its proper role. He concluded that reason is a valuable instrument but not the final authority. When reason attempts to serve as the foundation of certainty, it exceeds its capacity. But when it functions as a tool within a more comprehensive awareness, it becomes reliable and precise. You begin to see how this applies to your own thinking. When the mind claims absolute authority, it becomes rigid, defensive, and unable to question itself. But when it recognizes its limits, it becomes clearer and more honest. It analyzes without pretending to be the source of truth. It evaluates without claiming to possess reality in full. Reason becomes disciplined rather than dominating. In this reordered state, thinking aligns with insight rather than competing with it. The intellect serves understanding instead of constructing it. It becomes a means of articulation, not the origin of meaning. This transformation allows thought to operate without the burden of certainty. It becomes efficient, flexible, and free. If reason becomes trustworthy only when it stops claiming final authority, what then is the true ground of certainty? As you follow this inquiry to its conclusion, you begin to observe moments when thought naturally subsides. These are not dramatic or mystical experiences. They are simple pauses in the stream of mental activity. Between one thought and the next, awareness remains steady, quiet, unconstructed. Al-Ghazali recognized that this silent awareness is the beginning of genuine certainty. It is not shaped by interpretation, not colored by preference, not influenced by desire. It does not argue or defend. It simply is. When thinking falls silent, awareness continues unaffected. This reveals that thought is not the essence of knowing but a function within a deeper field of presence. You begin to understand that clarity does not come from multiplying arguments but from recognizing the space in which arguments appear. This recognition does not require effort. It requires noticing. If awareness persists without thought, then what role does thought play in knowing at all? At the end of this inquiry, thinking no longer appears as the source of certainty. It becomes an instrument for expression rather than discovery. You see that truth does not arise from constructing conclusions but from allowing the mind to rest. Al-Ghazali understood that when the intellect stops grasping for certainty, clarity reveals itself. This is not a belief or an argument. It is the recognition that awareness remains when thought ceases, and this awareness does not depend on justification. In this stillness, the search ends, not because all questions are answered, but because the one asking the questions becomes quiet. If truth appears only when the self stops claiming it, then who has been searching for truth all along?